The Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
And I ask unanimous consent that the following senators be permitted to speak for the following number of minutes. And finally, that Senator Scott of Florida or his designee be recognized to make a motion to proceed to calendar number 315, H.A. Res. 142. Senator Schumer for 15 minutes, Senator Durbin for 15 minutes, Senator Schatz for 10 minutes, Senator Booker for 10 minutes, Senator Murphy for 10 minutes, Senator Warner for 5 minutes, Senator Van Hollen for 10 minutes, Senator also Brooks for 5 minutes, Senator Kane for 10 minutes, Senator Wyden for 5 minutes, Senator Hogan for 10 minutes, Senator Kennedy for 20 minutes, Senator Scott, for 5 minutes. And, Mr. President, I have 4 requests for committees to meet during today's session. The Senate, they have the approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Without objection. And duly noted. The Democratic Leader.
Mr. President, yesterday, something happened in America that should send a chill down the spine of every American. A grand jury rejected the Justice Department's attempt to indict 6 Democratic lawmakers over a video they posted telling military members not to follow illegal orders. The President of the United States tried to use prosecutors to silence the free speech of sitting elected lawmakers because he didn't like what they said. That is a line no president in modern American history has ever crossed. May we have order, Mr. President? The video in question broke no laws. It simply urged members of our military to refuse unlawful orders, to honor the Constitution above any individual. What these members of Congress said was not radical. It's embedded in the oath every service member takes. The only crime committed here was refusing to bend to the knee of Donald Trump. And when this administration tried to dress up retaliation as prosecution, a grand jury of Americans rejected it. Today, I just want to say how proud and grateful I am for my colleagues, Senators Slotkin and Kelly, as well as Representatives Crow, DeLuzio, Goodlander, and Houlihan. The entire Democratic caucus is proud of them, proud of their courage, their poise, their loyalty to our democracy and to our Constitution. Senate Democrats will not let this witch hunt go unanswered. The American people deserve to know whether prosecutorial power was misused, abused for political ends. And I say to my Republican colleagues, if the executive branch can merely attempt to prosecute members of the legislative branch for simply exercising free speech, that is not a Democratic problem or a Republican problem. It is a constitutional crisis. If Republicans believe in the Constitution, if they believe in separation of powers, now is the moment, if there ever was one, to prove it. Yesterday, the Constitution held because ordinary citizens in a grand jury upheld it. They upheld it when this administration refused and when Senate Republicans remained silent. But we should not confuse failure with intent. Yes, this indictment failed, but the mere fact that it was even attempted is alarming. This indictment was a test of whether federal prosecutors could be weaponized to become political henchmen, a test of whether dissent could be smeared as criminality, a test of whether fear could suffocate freedom. The test should make our bones tremble. Today, it was 6 Democrats. Tomorrow, it could be anyone. Because if a president believes that he can even attempt to jail senators over speech he dislikes, then the First Amendment is no longer a basic right. It becomes a privilege, one that some Americans get to have and others don't, depending on their political views. And what would that mean for every journalist, every protester, every citizen who dares to dissent? It would mean more jailings, more investigations, more masked agents beating up unarmed peaceful protesters in the streets. It's happening already. And if we don't halt it, it's going to get a lot worse. The First Amendment is not optional. It doesn't depend on your political views. And it is not subject to the personal sensitivities of any president. Finally, the failure of this indictment does not erase what it represents. A president willing to test whether the criminal justice system can be weaponized against his political democracy, something that, if he succeeded, would stab a dagger through the heart of this democracy and all it represents. The founders wrote our Constitution precisely to prevent the kind of abuses Donald Trump and his Justice Department are doing. Thank God that today the Constitution held firm. But we cannot always assume that that will be the case if we aren't willing to defend it. So I am proud of Senators Kelly and Slotkin. I am proud of Representatives Crow, DeLuzio, Goodlander, and Houlihan. They stood by their oath. Now this chamber must stand by ours. It's a very good thing that these indictments failed, but these indictments go way beyond 6 members of Congress recording one video. Donald Trump has declared war on free speech in America. The wellspring of our democracy, free speech. And he's using the vast powers of the federal government to go after anyone who tries to stand up to him. To my Republican colleagues, silence in moments like this is not neutrality. It is permission, it is submission, it is acquiescing to the possibility that our democracy may be dying. I yield the floor.
Mr. President, let me associate myself with the remarks of the Minority Leader, Senator Schumer. What happened yesterday in the courts of District of Columbia was on one side of the equation frightening and another side encouraging. Frightening that any administration would think that they can quash the free speech of members of Congress, that they can be indicting people, charging them with crimes for simply speaking out as an elected member of Congress. Like Senator Schumer said, there is no precedent that I can think of in American history. There has never been a president who used this Department of Justice to quiet Congress in this way. We have gone through many events in the history of the United States that are earth-shattering, the Civil War being the worst, but we've never seen this happen. The fact that the grand jury of residents of the District of Columbia stood up and rejected this indictment of two senators and several members of the House is proof positive that people still understand the basic values of our Constitution. And one of them is our freedom of expression, the freedom to speak, the freedom to express our point of view. They stood up yesterday in an extraordinary fashion. Why did it ever reach this point that the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia tried to quiet members of Congress because of the objection of the administration to what they were saying? This was a test, but I hope it was the last test. But we shouldn't be so naive as to believe it is. It is up to us, Democrats and Republicans, for good of this Constitution and the value of the good of the Congress and the value of the Constitution, to stand behind those members who are exercising their rights as elected members of the Congress. Mr. President, 2 weeks ago, in another event which is worth noting, the FBI descended on Fulton County, Georgia, to seize hundreds of thousands of ballots from the 2020 presidential election. Reports indicate President Trump personally ordered the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, a prominent 2020 election denier, to go to Georgia for the raid. The president then spoke directly to the FBI agents who conducted the raid. To state the obvious, it is completely inappropriate for the president and the Director of National Intelligence to be personally involved in a domestic criminal investigation. But Attorney General Pam Bondi has allowed the president to weaponize her department and federal law enforcement to pursue his personal and political goals. Why did they target Fulton County? It's notorious, because this jurisdiction has been at the center of President Trump's false and baseless claims concerning so-called fraud in the 2020 election, an election he still refuses to acknowledge and concede. I remember well that recorded conversation on the telephone between the President of the United States, Donald Trump, and the Georgia Secretary of State. It was in early 2021, and President Trump directed the Georgia Secretary of State to, quote, find, close quote, the 11,780 votes he needed to swing the election his way. He said it. Those were his words, his voice. And I remember when he incited a mob of his most ardent supporters to storm this very Capitol, this very Senate chamber, to subvert the will of the people and overturn the results of a free and fair election. He failed, but now his end game for 2026 has become clear. He's working to rewrite the rules of the game and to rig the system to ensure he maintains his grip on power beyond the reach of the American people in a free and fair election. Don't believe me? Think about the past. Last year, in the spirit of his order to Georgia officials to find 11,780 votes, President Trump demanded that the state of Texas find him 5 more congressional seats before voters headed to the polls this coming November. Donald Trump demanded Republicans in the Texas legislature gerrymander 5 red seats in a redistricting scheme so he could cut his losses, literally, and hold on to the House after the upcoming midterm. In the meantime, the administration has deployed thousands of immigration enforcement agents to cities like Minneapolis and Chicago, cities in states that did not vote for President Trump. I never thought I'd witness an America where masked federal agents in military tactical gear violently arrest innocent Americans because of the color of their skin, the so-called Kavanaugh stops. An American where citizens like Chicagoan Miramar Martinez can be shot 5 times by federal agents with impunity, be branded falsely as a domestic terrorist. Thankfully, unlike Renee Good, Alex Petty, and Silveria Villegas Gonzalez, Ms. Martinez survived and testified 2 weeks ago. And DHS has directed immigration agents to crash down the doors of our private homes to arrest people without any judicial warrant in blatant disregard to the clear language of the Fourth Amendment. In the wake of this immigration enforcement surge and the ensuing chaos, Attorney General Bondi had the nerve in a letter to Minnesota Governor Tim Walz to offer him a reprieve. All he had to do was to turn over the voter files in his state. Thankfully, he refused. An attorney for the state described it as, quote, a ransom note from the Attorney General. If you're Donald Trump, you want these voter rolls to push unwarranted purges and disenfranchise voters, especially voters who aren't likely to support you in the next election. In fact, the Justice Department has now sued dozens of states for their voter rolls. All of this is textbook authoritarianism, vintage fascism, and I fear the President of the United States is working to rig the system to ensure that Republicans never lose another election. Has that thought crossed their mind? Listen to what Trump ally Steve Bannon said last week. We're going to have ICE surround the polling places. We'll never again allow an election to be stolen. You heard that right. Donald Trump and his allies want to deploy militarized agents to polling locations to intimidate and deter Americans from actually voting. In deploying ICE and attempting to deploy the National Guard, Trump has already established a precedent for paramilitary force that answers only to him patrolling our streets. Last week, Trump said the quiet part out loud. Here's what he said. The Republicans should say, we want to take over. We should take over the voting in at least 15 places. The Republicans ought to nationalize voting. Those are the words of Donald Trump. Article 1 of the Constitution and decades of Supreme Court precedent make it clear that the president cannot take over the administration of elections from the states. I'm old enough to remember when Republicans actually cared about the Constitution and the concept of federalism. Imagine for a moment if Barack Obama or Joe Biden had called for nationalizing an election and told federal agents they could raid private homes without judicial warrants and approval. The president's aims are clear. He wants to make the case for the big lie that the 2020 election was stolen from him so he can assuage his fragile ego and justify directly interfering in the 2026 and 2028 elections. Republican senators won't speak up, but the American people at the polls will. In the streets of Minneapolis and Chicago and in the halls of the U.S. Capitol, we hear their voices. We will do everything in our power to save our democracy from a president with such disdain for our Constitution and our democracy. I yield the floor.
The senator from Hawaii.
Where's the red line? You know, a lot of us wake up every day trying to figure out exactly how bad is it? Is this the moment that Republican members of the United States Senate are going to stand up for not our rights, but their rights? And not just United States senators, but everyone who put us in office. Last night, there was a failed indictment of 2 United States senators, and the indictment, we don't know what they were charged with, but it was about a 90-second video in which they reiterated the guidance from the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And by the way, even if you don't like what they said, even if you thought it was unwise what they said, even if you thought it was provocative what they said, it was not illegal. They have a perfect right under the Constitution, the First Amendment, to express themselves. That is not illegal. That is not seditious. That is not worthy of a court-martial. That is literally them doing their jobs. You can criticize them in the manner in which they do their jobs, but you may not incarcerate them. In addition to the First Amendment, they have specific constitutional rights for members of Congress under the Speech and Debate Clause. In other words, if you are doing something as a United States Senator, and they very clearly were, you have additional protections. And why does that matter? Not because we're overly concerned with 100 of the most privileged people on the planet, but because this place represents United States citizens who put us all into office, and then we get to say what we want. And so I ask my colleagues, where is the red line? Apparently not this one. Why? And I've had several interactions with my Republican colleagues, and it basically comes down to, well, the system held. This was a failed indictment. And so here's my question for my Republican colleagues. What if it's successful? What if Pam Bondi instructs Jeanine Pirro to try again and again and again until they perp walk Alyssa Slotkin and Mark Kelly and incarcerate them? Is that your red line? It is not obvious to me that anybody has even contemplated where exactly the line is. For me, it's been crossed. For me, it's been crossed. But I just ask my colleagues, do you even have a line? Is there some Rubicon that if they cross it, you will say, my God, I don't want to speed run this place into turning into Belarus. It is not that important to have this job. If what it means is we are collapsing American-style democracy on purpose. And whatever irritation I have with another member from another party at what they said or did, that's not illegal, and they should not be incarcerated. And the fact that they failed in their attempt to incarcerate a United States senator should not obviate our outrage. They tried to incarcerate 2 of us. I am not entirely sure that the United States Senate can survive this if we do not have Republicans standing up for our most basic principles. Tomorrow night, very likely, a bunch of people are going to go to the Munich Security Conference. And on a bipartisan basis, they're going to say, American-style democracy is still intact. Look at this bipartisan coalition. We still want to be part of the world. We still want to be engaged with Europe. We still want to protect democracies. And they are going to say nothing about the fact that the president tried to jail one of us. And so spare me the high-minded panel discussions and bilats and press availabilities about the United States as the indispensable nation when we are dispensing with our most sacred constitutional obligations. You know, now it was a long time ago, but it feels like yesterday that I was first sworn in, right in that corner. And I don't remember it exactly, but you swear an oath to the Constitution and laws of the United States of America, and that you take that obligation freely and without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion. And I am afraid we are evading our most fundamental responsibilities. And so I don't have any illusions that like this speech is going to change everybody's mind, but I would just start the dialogue. What is it going to take for you to say, enough is enough? I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from New Jersey.
I had a sleepless night last night as I put together in my mind where I think we are as a nation right now. We are a nation that, looking across our great land, shows unequivocally that we are in crisis. We are in a constitutional crisis. And from people in our communities to people in this body, we are seeing grotesque attacks on our most sacred constitutional principles. As I sat last night, I found myself scrolling through words of our founding fathers, and something Madison said really stuck out at me, that power needs to be checked. Power needs to be balanced. Power derives its right from the consent of the governed, but power itself does not self-correct. I look at what's happening from the executive branch and see over and over again grotesque violations of our Constitution, and this body is doing nothing. The list of what's happening is clear. It's actually making headlines. It's not something that can be ignored. But when you see the President of the United States taking power from the people, taking power from the executive, resisting the power of the judiciary, breaking the law, the rule of law, and nothing happens, it reminds me of Frederick Douglass. Find out just what a people will submit to, and that is the exact amount of injustice that will be heaped upon them. Well, what are the constitutional ruptures we are seeing so clear right now? Well, we've seen them with the president's grift, graft, and corruption. I said this to some of my colleagues earlier. If a headline had appeared a few decades ago of the President of the United States and a sheik coming together days before he ascended to the presidency, where that sheik is giving him tens of millions of dollars in what amounts to almost a direct payout, enriching him and his family in a trumped-up crypto scheme, that is clearly seen from our founders as a breach of the Constitution in a clause called the Emoluments Clause. This president is using his position to profit off of as he oversees foreign policy, and we are seeing leaders come to him and give him millions of dollars as they have foreign policy considerations before them. That is a rupture of the Constitution. What is another example? We are literally seeing people in the streets in Minnesota exercising their constitutional rights of protest, their constitutional rights of speech, their constitutional rights to hold law enforcement accountable for doing nothing wrong but filming law enforcement. How many of us have seen the videos of people filming law enforcement and getting beaten, getting literally kicked, getting handcuffed, being put in jail? Or the worst of all constitutional violations is when you attack someone's life, as we saw with Alex Preddy being murdered. We see more ruptures to our Constitution, not just the oppression of basic rights by our people, but that other sacrosanct right that our founders saw when it comes to the right to vote. We have a president saying literally that the Constitution should not apply, that we should federalize elections, and you see the president sending his Justice Department not to investigate the last election or the election before that, not the election he won, but going back to 2020's election, and seizing private voting records that belong to the state in a claim that has been proven wrong over and over again, that there was some kind of election fraud, the big lie as it's called. That too is a rupture of our Constitution. He is violating voting rights. He is violating speech rights. He is violating the freedom to protest your government. He is violating the Emoluments Clause. He is violating the powers of the legislative branch as he stops funding that was approved in a bipartisan way from this body, like he just did in my state with the biggest infrastructure project there is. Again and again and again, this president is violating our Constitution. From literally agents masked, jumping out of unmarked cars, going into our churches, going into our schools. This president violates our Constitution over and over and over again. But here is a truth spoken when constitutional rights were violated against an activist named Angela Davis, that this body is now seeing clearly what James Baldwin wrote. You see, the truth of our land has always been injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, as Martin Luther King says. As the great Langston Hughes wrote in poetry, there's a dream in this land with its back against the wall. To save the dream for one, you must save the dream for all. Well, here is the rights. Here is the sacrosanct document that we swear oaths to, the Constitution. Here is the truth that the injustices that we are seeing and the violations will be visited upon this body, because as James Baldwin wrote so clearly, if they come for you in the morning, well, they're going to come for me at night. Well, we have now seen last night that they were coming for members of this body. And no, I'm not talking about House members like LaMonica MacGyver that has been thrown down, handcuffed, and is on trial right now. No, I'm not talking about Adam Schiff, who was investigated for trumped-up charges. No, I'm not talking about Alex Padilla, who was thrown to the ground and handcuffed in a federal building. No, I'm talking about my colleagues Alyssa Slotkin and Mark Kelly, who literally quoted military manuals that say it's illegal to follow unjust and illegal laws, that they have a right to not follow unjust, illegal orders. Literally quoting what is the law of the land. And what did this out-of-control executive do? What did this out-of-control executive do? An executive that has already reached and taken away the power of the purse. An executive that has already violated court orders that we've seen come from the highest office in the land, the Supreme Court. An executive who's violated the emoluments clause. A president who brags about taking away states' rights to control their own elections. A president that has violated the law time and time again. What did he do with his Justice Department? He called together a grand jury, used officials from our Justice Department that should be keeping us safe, used them to go after two members of this body in an attempt to criminally charge them for their constitutional rights, protected in the Constitution, the speech and debate clause. There are books that have been written from On Tyranny to How Democracies Die, long before this administration, that predicted that this country's real threat will not be from some foreign enemy, it will be from internal corruption that goes unchecked. That this nation's real threat is not from any adversary that cannot beat this nation, this mighty country. The real threat to this nation is when the Constitution we swear an oath to is eroded and the people with the power to stop it do nothing. That is how great nations have fallen in the past. Not from those who violate Constitution, who violate the rule of law, who violate the freedom of the people. The nations fall when the people that have the power to do something about it remain silent, sit on the sidelines, remain quiet, or submit to the will of an out-of-control executive. The road to hell is paved with people who have the power to stop bad things from happening but say nothing. Our constitutional norms, the laws of our land, the principles upon which we stand are being violated every week in our nation. Americans being swept up off of our streets, Americans' freedom of speech, Americans' privacy, the lives of American citizens
Senator's
being
time has
taken,
expired.
even people in the Senate being arrested. And so now I say unequivocally,
The senator's time has expired.
I ask unanimous consent for 2 more minutes. Is there an objection?
Is there an objection? Without objection.
Thank you. In this body, I see cowardice now. I see people afraid that the president will retaliate against them if they stand up and say something. Well, Thomas Jefferson said it clearly. When the people are afraid of government, there is tyranny. When the government is afraid of the people, there is liberty. We have a president that calls people up and threatens to run primaries against my colleague. We have billionaires that say, I'll put $20 million in opposition if you don't submit to the unconstitutional actions of the executive. 2 of our colleagues arrested for their free speech, put a grand jury summoned to try to arrest them for their free speech. And I hear silence. We are in a constitutional crisis. The silence is complicity. The failure to stand up and speak up is an insult to our ancestry. We are in a moment of crisis. I fear for this body, I fear for this institution, I fear for our Constitution, but I still have faith on the people. We can stop this erosion of our constitutional norms. We could stop this democratic backsliding. We can protect our rights and our values, but more people need to speak up. And it is a shame upon this body that those who have power and position now do nothing. I yield the floor.
The senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the tendency here in the Senate often when Democrats are lodging a complaint about Donald Trump is for our Republican colleagues to issue an argument of equivalency. Well, Donald Trump did this, but so did Joe Biden. Donald Trump did that, but Joe Biden did this. We're at a moment today, though, in which there is no argument of equivalency. And in fact, over and over again in the past year, we have seen threats to our democracy that have no historical precedent. We must be able to agree that never before in the history of the Senate has a president of the United States sought to jail members of this body based upon their political opposition to the President of the United States. All that our colleagues did was record a video in which they simply repeated the law of the land, the existing military code, said things into a camera that the current Secretary of Defense has said himself, almost verbatim. But because he was reciting, because she was reciting a portion of the military code that the president objects to, because it was inherently a criticism of the president, they are now facing down possible indictment. It doesn't really matter that the grand jury refused to indict, because if they continue to come back over and over again for an indictment, they will likely find at some point some compliant grand jury, and we will find our colleagues headed to jail simply for exercising their free speech. Never before in the history of our country has something like this happened. And I understand that for all of us who have grown up in a relatively safe and secure American democracy, contested by foreign adversaries, but never under any real threat that we were going to lose the democracy from within, have come to believe some sense of inevitability about the survivability of American democracy. But every civilization, every form of government has an expiration date. Every attempt at republicanism or democracy over the course of this globe's history has ended, and ours will end at some point. Our job as senators, whether you have an R after your name or a D after your name, is to make sure that that end doesn't happen on our watch. And at some point, you have to look at the series of exceptional, unprecedented events that have happened in the last year and see them as part of an unprecedented ahistorical pattern. I agree with my colleagues. Long ago, in my mind, we crossed the red line. But think about it if the shoe was on the other foot. I want my Republican colleagues to think about what you would say if a Democratic president opened up a criminal investigation into the chairman of the Federal Reserve simply over a dispute over interest rate policy. What would my Republican colleagues say if a Democratic president deployed the National Guard against a Republican state like Texas or Louisiana? Would our Republican colleagues think it was a red line if Sean Hannity was taken down off the air by a Democratic president's FCC? What would Republicans say? Would it be a confrontation with American democracy if journalists were removed from a Democratic president's Pentagon because of their critical stories about the Democratic administration's policy? Would Republicans think there was a problem if universities were denied funding because they weren't hiring enough liberal left-wing professors? How about if a Democratic president confiscated ballots in one of your states so as to prove that Donald Trump didn't really win the election, that it was fraudulent? Or what if he indicted or attempted to indict two of your members, two Republicans, simply because they had raised their voices in objection to a Democratic president's policies? We all know the answer to every single one of those questions. If a Democratic president had done any of those things, you would be shutting down the United States Senate. You would be labeling each and every one of them as a potentially existential threat to our democracy, and you would use every lever available to you to try to confront that abuse of power. There is no equivalency argument. President Biden didn't do any of the things that I just listed. And yes, I know my Republican colleagues have objections about the way that he used the Department of Justice, objections about the things he said about Republicans, but never, never were Republican senators facing a grand jury, the threat of indictment hanging over their heads, simply because they spoke truth that a Democratic president objected to. At some point, this democracy will die. And our purpose here is to improve the quality of life for our constituents, but to protect the democracy at all costs. There has to be a bipartisan response to the broad abuses of power, but specifically, right now, to the fact that two of our colleagues are on the verge of being arrested by this president simply based on their political opposition to the president. This is a moment where we could decide to agree. Not everything has to be skins and shirts. Not everything that we think has to automatically be wrong. We could very easily decide this week that it is not acceptable for the President of the United States to attempt to throw into jail his political opponents in the Senate and in the House. And maybe that could provide a springboard for us to decide that there are other abuses of presidential authority that may, in the long run, harm both Republican and Democratic interests, but fundamentally harm the health of our democracy that we could join together in league against as well. This is a moment of test for the Senate. I agree with my colleague, Senator Schatz. This is a moment that could break this institution permanently if it is only Democrats standing up here and defending our colleagues. It should matter first that they are senators, that they were elected by the people of their state to represent Republicans and Democrats in their state. It should matter second, the party that is listed after their name. I yield the floor.
Senator from Louisiana.
Mr. President, I ask for an additional 15 minutes to make my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about a couple of different topics. First, I want to try to explain to the American people what's going on around here. Some people are going to try to tell you, American people, that what we're engaged in is a rational discussion of how to use scarce taxpayer dollars to fund the Department of Homeland Security. Now, that's not true. Wish it were. The Department of Homeland Security is about to shut down. We don't know how to get it back open. What does that mean? It means ICE will be shut down. We've got some ideas about how to keep it operating. They have enough money. It means TSA will be shut down. They're not going to be paid. That'll impact airport travel. Coast Guard be shut down. FEMA, God help us if we have a natural disaster, it'll be shut down. What's about to happen is top of the list, king of the hill, number one, stupid. And it's happening just not because of policy. It's happening because of raw gut politics. If you could see what I see, your gag reflex would be permanently triggered. Here's what's going on. The Karen wing of the Democratic Party is in control of the Democratic Party. And the Karen wing of the Democratic Party, not all Democrats, but there's clearly a Karen wing. Sometimes I call them the loon wing. They have gone to the Minority Leader Jeffries and my friend Senator Schumer and said, don't you vote for that Homeland Security bill. Why? Because the Karen wing of the Democratic Party wants to defund ICE. Now, we've seen this vampire movie before. The Karen wing of the Democratic Party also wanted us to defund the police. How'd that work out for us? The criminals are still laughing. Now they want to defund ICE. And Senator Schumer and Minority Leader Jeffries, two good men, they've made a bunch of unreasonable demands that no person with a brain above a single-cell organism would vote for. It would put handcuffs on ICE. That's just a fact. And they know that. I'm not going to vote for them. Sure not going to vote for them with a gun to my head. Now, but I'll tell you the reality. We could go to Senator Schumer and the Minority Leader in the House and say, okay, we accept every one of your conditions. The Democrats still are not going to vote to keep DHS open. I mean, I don't blame Senator Schumer for trying, but he's kind of wandering around here like one of those Roombas. He looks like a man who's lost his luggage at the airport. I mean, he's making these demands, and if we accepted them, we're not, but if we did, he couldn't deliver the votes. Because nobody on my side of the aisle wants to defund ICE. And that's what this is all about. And some of my colleagues are trying to pretty it up. Lots of play acting. They might be late, a little late for getting their name in for the Academy Awards, but maybe next year. They're trying to muddy the water, make it look deep. Like we're having this discussion about efficiencies at the Department of Homeland Security. Nope, very simple. The Karen wing of the Democratic Party has told every single Democrat, if you don't vote to shut down DHS, if you do vote to fund ICE, we will punish you politically the rest of your natural lives. That's why we're about to have a shutdown. Now, this stuff isn't complicated. Here's what I think most Americans believe. Illegal immigration, Mr. President, is illegal. Duh. If none of us are above the law, I believe that. I bet you believe that. If no one is above the law, how come people in our country illegally are above the law? Immigration statutes are not some second-tier laws that you can violate without consequence. It's the law. If you don't like it, change it. I believe in enforcing our immigration laws. Now, how you enforce them matters. By God, you better believe it matters. Those laws have got to be enforced in conformity with equal protection and with due process and in accordance with standards set forth by the United States Supreme Court. I think it was 1968 in a very famous case called Terry v. Ohio. Cop can't stop you unless that cop has reasonable suspicion, not probable cause, reasonable suspicion to believe that you have committed, are committing, or is about to commit a crime. It's not subjective. It's an objective standard. And our cops, including but not limited to our ICE officers, have to follow it. Now, you can protest. That's fine. That's your right to protest. You don't have the right to protest violently. You don't have the right to harass an ICE officer. You don't have a right to spit in his face. You don't have a right to threaten his children. You don't have a right to get his home address and go to his house and try to harass his family. You don't have the right to block the street so the ICE officer can't get through. You don't have the right to kick out a cop's tail light. You don't have the right to go burn Christmas trees. You have the right to protest. But not violently. Because you know what? Two reasons. Violence undermines the morality that you say your movement is built upon. Dr. King knew that. That's why he wanted nonviolent protest. Gandhi knew that. President Mandela knew that in South Africa. Violence undermines the morality that you say your movement is built on. Now, there's a second reason that you can't protest violently. It's against the law. And it's bone deep, down to the marrow, stupid. If you act like a butthead with a cop or an ICE officer, it's not going to end well. It's not going to end well. Here's a little tip. It's free. Cops will leave you alone unless you do illegal stuff. And that's what this debate is all about. I hope we get it worked out. I don't want to see flights stop. I don't want to see FEMA not be able to respond. I don't want to see the Coast Guard have to shut down. But the Karen wing of the Democratic Party is the cause of this. And they're going to have to accept the fact that the law is the law, or they're going to have to get the votes to change it. Because the American people, American people see immigration like they see the front door of their home. Most Americans lock their front door at night. Why do they do that? They don't lock their front door at night because they hate everybody on the outside. They lock the front door at night because they love the people on the inside. And they want to know who's coming into and out of their home. And that's the way the American people see our borders. Legal immigration, great. We admit more people, more of our world's neighbors, to come to America and become part of us every year than any other country. And the whole world knows it. That's why everybody wants to come here. When's the last time you heard of somebody trying to sneak into China? I want to come here. It's called legal immigration. But you can't jump the line. You got to fill out the forms and be properly vetted. You can't just come in. Now, President Biden didn't follow the law. That's why we're in this mess today. We don't know how many people he let in. I'm not saying they were all bad people. I don't know them. That's the point. We don't know who they are. I don't even know the number. Anywhere from 8 million to 15 million. Some of them were bad people. But we don't have the slightest idea who they are. And we don't know where they are. And that's why we have the rule of law. And that's why we have ICE. And that's what's going on. The second thing I want to talk about, Mr. President, I want to choose my words carefully here because I love Louisiana. Louisiana's a great state. I think God blessed Louisiana, and having blessed us once, God blessed us twice. We're located at the top of the Gulf Coast. Those of you who've been there know we're in the middle of the Gulf South. We straddle one of the mightiest rivers in the entire world. We've got more oil and gas than most nations. We're experts in things like petrochemical manufacturing and oil and gas exploration, aquaculture, agriculture, and education, healthcare. I could keep going. Timber production. My people they're God-fearing, they're hard-working, and they're fun-loving. We're right next door to Texas. Texas gets a lot of good publicity. More power to them. But don't forget this. Texas is 5.5 times bigger than Louisiana. We're 10.5 times more interesting than they are. So I love Louisiana. But sometimes some of my people do dumb things. We're all human. And something just happened at Mardi Gras that turned my stomach. And let me say, I love New Orleans. I used to live in New Orleans. I practiced law in New Orleans. I met my wife in New Orleans. I raised my son for the first couple of years of his life in New Orleans. Wonderful city. We have this tradition called Mardi Gras. And it's not just one day, it's like several weeks. And people from the entire world come to celebrate with us. Name me another city, any city, that just shuts down the entire city for one day in the middle of the week to just enjoy life. And we celebrate together. Every race, every religion, every socioeconomic class, we're all together. And we have parades. And these floats are big floats. You know what I mean if you've been to New Orleans and have seen Mardi Gras. But if you haven't, these floats these are big puppies. They're anywhere from, 30 to 60 feet long. And they're tall, anywhere from 13 to 18 feet. And crew members, each parade is organized by what's called a crew. It's like a club. the crew members ride on the floats. And they throw beads. And they throw toys. And some of them throw coconuts to the crowd. And the crowds are lined up by the side of the street, 8, 10, 12 feet deep. All flavors of humanity. Throw me something, mister. Throw me something, mister. But if you're a float rider, I've only done it once. One of the first things you're taught is to be careful. Because these beads, maybe a single strand of beads is not that dangerous. But a lot of people on the floats throw beads in groups. And a coconut, whether it's a single coconut or several, I can tell you, is a mighty missile. And so you're taught to be careful where you throw and try to throw to people when they see it coming. Because otherwise, if you get hit in the face with a bunch of beads or a coconut, you're going to get hurt. You can lose an eye. I've had it happen to me. It's dangerous. And they teach the float riders this. Now, we have a lot of our cops. We have to borrow some cops from some other counties, we call them parishes, to come help us. Because there's some jackaloons who misbehave at the parades. So we have a lot of our cops out. And I think it was this past weekend, I want to get the name right, we had the crew of Carrollton sponsored a float. Wonderful people in the crew of Carrollton, one of the oldest crews we have. But there were some knuckleheads on one of those floats. And they were taking bunches of beads and trying to hurt the cops with them. Now, the cops are not looking at the floats. The cops are looking at the crowds. And the cops are watching the people to make sure they don't have too many cocktails and try to run between floats and get run over. And the cops are watching the children because we have a lot of our kids. We bring a lot of our kids. The cops are not looking. They're not going, throw me something, mister. They're doing their job. And 41 people on one of the crew of Carrollton floats were throwing beads and toys and other stuff trying to hit the cops in the face. And it wasn't just one or two. It was disgraceful. The police had to shut down the parade, to their credit. They shut her down. And they pulled all 41 people off this float and said, you're out of here. And the cops did the right thing. And it's embarrassing for me to have to say this, that this happened in my state, in my city, but it did. Now, the mayor's issued a statement. Thank you, Mayor. Hadn't heard our city council say a word, not a peep. That doesn't mean they hadn't. I apologize if I missed it. And it's no secret that many of my people in New Orleans think that cops are a bigger problem than criminals. This is America. You can believe what you want. And a lot of people, we went through the defund the police, jackassery. And a lot of my people in New Orleans, it's a sanctuary city. I know they say they're not, but most of my local law enforcement officials don't cooperate with ICE. They think the borders ought to be wide open. I don't. It's against the law. But this is America. They can believe that. But you can't hurt cops. And these 41 people, after receiving due process, if they did this, they shouldn't just be disciplined. Oh, you can't ride next year. They need to prosecute. And the people in New Orleans need to demand it. Acts have consequences. And you don't have the right to hurt cops just because you don't like them. I've said this many, many times. I get in trouble every time, but I believe it. If you hate cops just because they're cops, next time you get in trouble, have at it. Call a crackhead and see what happens. See if they'll protect you. So I'm sorry this happened. I want to apologize to the people, the good people in New Orleans, for these 41 skillet heads who did this, allegedly. I want to apologize for the people of America who've read about this or who saw it, came down to love on my city some. But I don't want to ever see this happen again. And every one of those 41 people ought to be prosecuted and then made to hide their head in a bag for their entire prison sentence. Mr. President, I'm done. Mr. Parliamentarian, you want me to ask for a roll call or yield the floor? Or I'm at your pleasure. I yield the floor in the absence of quorum. I don't pay attention to Tony. Is he right? Okay. I can ask for a quorum call. That's okay with you, Tony? All right. I got belt and suspenders here, parliamentarian and Tony. I suggest the absence of a quorum, Mr. President.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks.
President.
The senator from Oregon,
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent to vacate the quorum call.
without objection.
Mr. President, in a little bit, the Senate is going to decide whether or not to interfere with the tax policy decisions made by the elected representatives of the 700,000 people who live in the nation's capital. My view is leave D.C. alone. There are a lot of very good reasons to oppose this resolution. For one, anybody who listens to debates here in the Congress hears an awful lot of talk from the other side about states' rights, the importance of making policy decisions at the state and local level. This resolution is just another example of my Republican colleagues totally junking that proposition altogether to trample on the rights and priorities of people they don't even represent. Second, if the Senate passes this resolution, it's going to mess up the tax filing season for thousands and thousands of residents of the city. The D.C. government's going to have to spend millions fixing that mess over the course of several months. So you can forget about all the speeches about good government and fiscal discipline when it comes to this resolution. It's undemocratic and wasteful. And third, and here's the stunner, if the Senate passes this resolution, it would throw out two big anti-poverty programs that the D.C. area is implementing: a brand new child tax credit and a big expansion of D.C.'s earned income tax credit. So the end effect here is thousands more kids living in poverty and higher rates of poverty overall in the nation's capital. The elected representatives in D.C. looked at the city's big economic challenges made lots worse by the Trump administration. And then they decided to shore up the city's fiscal health and bring down poverty at the same time. I asked my colleagues on the other side, who are you to overrule them? Let's remember, if Congress sits back and leaves the District of Columbia alone, absolutely nothing changes for us, and absolutely nothing changes for the people we represent at home. When it comes to making life better for our constituents, this is literally a waste of time. All this resolution does is stick it to a bunch of kids and families living in poverty, meddle with democracy in a city of 700,000 people, and waste millions of dollars by creating bureaucratic headaches out of thin air. I urge my colleagues strongly to oppose this resolution. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I stand here in opposition to House Joint Resolution 142. D.C. passed a law last summer decoupling from certain tax provisions of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. This decision was a targeted and time-limited move instituted for 225 days to evaluate revenue impacts and determine which changes could be incorporated in a fiscally responsible manner. D.C.'s decoupling also does not alter or eliminate any federal tax benefits enacted by Congress. Their law applies only to district taxes, and it's not an action solely taken by D.C. In fact, at least 13 states have taken similar steps, and roughly 20 states require legislative review before implementation rather than automatically adopting tax code changes. And while some states decoupled entirely for 2025, D.C. only decoupled from 13 of the 84 tax provisions, with the possibility that D.C. could still implement some of what they decoupled from once they finalize their review and determine the fiscal impact. These moves are standard in state tax administration. They are consistent with states accounting for situations unique to them and their residents, making sure that implementation happens smoothly. They are done to make sure that taxpayers and the governments alike have some measure of certainty. This resolution of disapproval will do just the opposite. It would cause significant uncertainty and chaos. Not for the federal government. This resolution would have no effect on the federal government or federal operations. The chaos would all be placed on D.C. This resolution would literally change the rules in the middle of the game while taxpayers have already started filing returns. It would require revising tax forms and systems and could force taxpayers to refile returns. It would create confusion for families, businesses, and tax professionals. The chaos would result in a revenue loss of $600 million over the next 4 years. Because D.C.'s law funds the district child tax credit and enhancements to D.C.'s earned income tax credit, this resolution would hurt D.C.'s admirable and groundbreaking efforts to address child poverty and provide a boost to low-income residents. And the fallout would not only impact businesses in D.C., but also spread to businesses in surrounding states like mine. Adopting this resolution of disapproval would make us agents of chaos, and we would be breaking decades of precedent to do it. Congress has rarely, if ever, overturned district laws through disapproval resolutions, and Congress has never before reversed a district revenue-raising measure. Our action would be so rare and so chaotic that it will have a damaging effect on D.C.'s bond rating. Credit rating agencies have warned that congressional interference in local revenue decisions can weaken D.C.'s credit standing and increase borrowing costs. This goes against why we are here. We're not here to cause economic instability and hurt taxpayers. We're here to help. This isn't about party line or ideology. D.C.'s independent, nonpartisan chief financial officer has raised serious concerns about the instability that this would cause. D.C.'s business community strongly opposes the resolution. Hospital, realtors, builders, hotels, and major employers aren't making ideological calls, but pleas for certainty. And every other state represented here, red and blue, including those which went further in their own tax determinations, would be watching us set a new precedent, the possibility of their informed judgment being overridden by unnecessary federal overreach, inviting chaos across their state lines. For these reasons, I urge all of my colleagues today to join me in voting against this resolution. And with that, I yield back.
Senator from Virginia.
Could I inquire if we're in a quorum call?
We are not.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today, and I know other colleagues have done the same, to talk about House Joint Resolution 142, the resolution we'll be voting on later. It's a resolution that would overturn a recent law passed by the D.C. City Council regarding local taxes. I care a lot about this, not just because Virginia is a neighbor to D.C., but I have been a mayor and a governor and dealt with local and state tax issues and the interplay between those issues and federal taxation. Last year, this body, with colleagues across the aisle carrying the ball, passed a large reconciliation bill which included numerous changes to the federal tax code. Now, everyone here is aware of this fact, that our system of federalism that is ingrained in our Constitution only gives us, in this body, authority over federal taxes. The reconciliation bill didn't and couldn't change Missouri's state income tax, Virginia's state income tax, Oklahoma's state income tax, or local property taxes for cities in those states. Some states, when there is federal tax legislation that's passed, choose to align their state and local tax policies directly with federal tax policy. That's called conformity. You make a change to the Internal Revenue Code. Some states choose, and it's their choice, to conform their own state tax code and even local tax codes with the federal tax codes. But other states choose, and again, this is a choice, to decouple all or parts of their tax code. They may accept most of the federal changes, but decide to go their own direction in a couple of areas. The important part is that this is part of a system of federalism, and it's a choice that states and localities get to make. Blue and red states have made decisions to decouple in the aftermath of dealing with the reconciliation bill from last year. Alabama is a very red state. They decided to decouple their state tax system from some of the provisions in the reconciliation bill. My state, Virginia, made that decision. So did California. Altogether, now 19 states have affirmatively chosen to decouple some portion of their tax code from the tax changes that were made in the reconciliation bill. And another 20 to 30 states, Mr. President, haven't yet made that determination. Their state legislatures are grappling with it right now. Look, if Kansas decides to lower state taxes for millionaires in a way that Democrats disagree with, I can't, as a U.S. Senator, introduce and pass a bill that would stop them and force them to use that funding, say, for local schools instead. That's not in my power. But because of the Home Rule Act, Congress has the ability to intercede in local laws passed by the District of Columbia. We could argue about whether that's a good idea or not. I actually think, as a former mayor and governor, we shouldn't be interceding. The District of Columbia elects a city government, a mayor and city council, and we should, in almost all instances, I believe, respect the wishes of those who live in D.C. and not impose our values on them, those of us who live in Virginia or Oklahoma or other states. I think that's the right rule, and I've long been a supporter of the District of Columbia having both self-governance and representation. The D.C. Home Rule Act was intended to serve as a pathway to allow them more freedom and authority to self-govern in relation to local affairs. It was a dramatic improvement of what came before. Specifically, it established the mayoral position, a city council, neighborhood commissioners that provide residents with direct representation on matters of local governance. Since the Home Rule Act was passed more than 50 years ago in 1973, Congress has respected the District of Columbia's authority and autonomy and rarely used this tool to overturn and nullify local matters. In fact, there's been only 4 instances in which this law has been invoked, and I believe this is the first time it's been invoked to challenge DC decisions about their own local taxes. Remember, DC is not making a decision about the federal tax code. They're making a decision about their own local taxes in a city council that is made up of people who have been elected by DC residents. If we pass the resolution that's before the body, we would be telling the city that they have to adopt tax policies that have nothing to do with what their constituents who elected their city council want. And this would be about local taxes, not federal taxes. DC residents have to pay federal taxes in accord with the laws we pass here. So the matter that we're contemplating on the floor is just interfering with DC's local taxes. We would be blowing a $600 million hole in the District of Columbia's budget if we pass this. And again, everyone in this body, all 100 senators, we live elsewhere. You know, we live elsewhere, but we would be blowing a $600 million hole in the budget for the people who live in the District of Columbia if we pass this. What did DC do? DC decided that they didn't want to conform their tax code to allow certain forms of accelerated depreciation for investments. Alabama actually made the same choice. They didn't conform their tax code over a similar part of the tax code. What did DC do instead? Instead of allowing this accelerated depreciation, DC decided that they would give a child tax credit to DC families. They viewed that as a more important thing to do with their local tax code than to do accelerated depreciation. I think that's a choice that makes perfect sense to me, and it certainly made sense to DC voters. So the impact of this will not only be to blow a hole in the budget and to mid-tax season create chaos, it will also be to take away an important priority whereby DC has decided that they want to put dollars in the pockets of families with children to help them with the expenses of raising a child. This will cause confusion and cost the city millions in additional expenses in addition to the revenue effect. I see my colleague from Virginia is on the floor, so I want to allow him to go quickly, but I do want to read a letter that's been written to the Senate by the DC business leadership. This is from the DC business and civic community, the Federal City Council, the Greater Washington Board of Trade, DC Chamber of Commerce, Apartment and Office Building Association, DC Association of Realtors, DC Hospital Association, the Building Authority, Association of Realtors, Hotel Association, a broad cross-section of the DC business community, and they've written a letter to us saying the following. We write you in unison as representatives of the District of Columbia's business organizations, urging you to oppose the joint resolution of disapproval, HJ Res 142, that would reverse the district's decision to decouple the local tax code from some provisions of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. A reversal of decoupling would create chaos in the middle of tax filing season. The district has already begun accepting and processing returns. It would take the DC government and private vendors months to adjust local tax administration. Filing deadlines would have to be pushed back to the fall of 2026. Local tax code decoupling from the federal tax code is not unique. Many states have voted to decouple from provisions in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, as they have many times in the past in response to federal tax changes. I read the letter from the business community because I want to make clear to people this is not just parents who want the child tax credit so that they can better afford to raise their children. It's also the business community in DC. Those of us who live elsewhere, we have the ability to affect tax policy at the state and local level in our own communities. We shouldn't impose our values over the DC residents who've elected a mayor and city council who've made tax policy for them, just as our own local and state officials make tax policy for us. And for that reason, both to not blow a hole in the DC budget, to respect the wishes of DC residents, to respect the need for child tax credit to support families And to respect the wishes of the DC business community, I ask my colleagues to oppose the resolution. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, I want to thank my friend, the senator from Virginia. He's laid out with great eloquence a lot of the tax reasons and business reasons, and I'm going to be relatively brief since I know the floor got backed up today, and I don't impose on the time of my friend, the senator from North Dakota. But I got a little unique view in this. I actually think I live closer to the district than anybody else of the 535 members of Congress. So my neighbors, my friends, my constituents work, visit, travel through the district all the time. And Senator Kaine went through how this is going to hurt the district. I echo all of that, but it's going to hurt the region. It's going to hurt Virginia. It's going to hurt Maryland. And while I was going to go through all of the same details on decoupling and the 19 issues, I'll move away from that. I echo everything he said. But I guess what I want to spend a couple minutes on is why in the heck has the Trump administration been hitting the District of Columbia so unrelentingly? Let's look back. Just as downtown was starting to recover from the pandemic, President Trump and DOJ began a wholesale assault on the federal workforce. Thousands of federal workers, people who go to local restaurants, go to DC businesses, were fired by the president or forced to take a buyout early. We've seen as well the president has taken a blowtorch to Washington's cultural treasures when he unlawfully, and I say this as a member of the Kennedy Center board, when he unlawfully put his name on the Kennedy Center and then acted surprised when groups around the country, artists around the country said, I'm not going to go to the Trump Kennedy or Kennedy Trump Center, and started canceling their engagements. Then out of the blue comes a decision to shut down the Kennedy Center for 2 years. Again, hurting not only the district, but the whole region. For those of us who visited the White House as tourists or as senators, even under President Trump, where the East Wing, the stately East Wing once stood, there's now a giant hole with a potential ballroom that I imagine at the end of the day may make the cost overruns at the Fed look tiny in comparison, at least on a percentage basis. We saw last year with the big bill, I will not call it by its chosen name. You know, this president and this administration has done so much to hurt the folks in D.C. at risk. You know, 38% of D.C. residents get their health care through Medicaid. More than 1 in every 3 D.C. residents. Yet the Medicaid cuts that will come, interestingly enough, in November after the elections, will literally put thousands and thousands of those residents off their health care. You know, instead of allowing the district, as Senator from Virginia said, to put that into child tax credits or other choices with their own money, instead, the president has taken this money, frankly, for tax cuts for the wealthiest. Now, I won't go through all the details again, but $658 million of D.C. residents' money paid in local taxes should not be taken away from the district. Remember, this comes on top of almost another $1 billion that the House tried to take away as well. So why would this Congress arbitrarily just blow a big budget hole in the district's budget? Truth is, this city's already been under unrelenting assault by this administration. Matter of fact, as Senator Kaine said, so many, if this goes through, the amount of bureaucracy in terms of refiling their taxes puts another burden as well. So, Mr. President, I join my friend, Senator Kaine, and I think all of us who care deeply about this region, this community, please, let's deal with our own states. Let's not meddle in the district's business. Let's not grab close to $700 million of D.C. taxes and punish this community one more time. I hope we're a better institution than that. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from North Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. President. I come to the floor today to discuss how in North Dakota we're building on the pro-energy policies included in the Working Families Tax Cut Act through an initiative that we call Crack the Code 2.0. This effort is about strengthening our nation's energy security, keeping electricity reliable and affordable, and assuring that America remains energy dominant for generations to come. More than 20 years ago, during my time as governor, North Dakota cracked the code for the first time and unleashed the shale oil revolution in the Bakken Formation in North Dakota. This success story didn't happen in a vacuum. We established the state's Oil and Gas Research Council. We worked with the North Dakota Geological Survey to identify new recoverable energy reserves. We put in place the legal, tax, and regulatory framework needed to encourage innovation and attract investment. This empowered oil producers to deploy the latest and greatest technologies to unlock energy reserves once thought unreachable. This success transformed North Dakota into one of the top energy-producing states in the nation and helped make the United States the world's largest oil and gas producer. Today, we're working to crack the code again. Through Crack the Code 2.0, we are bringing together our oil and coal industries by leveraging enhanced oil recovery, or EOR, using captured CO2 from North Dakota's coal-fired power plants to increase production from the Bakken oil formation. This approach brings together two of our nation's most abundant and strategic energy assets, our coal resources and our oil reserves, to achieve three goals. First, double the oil recovery rate in the Bakken, double the oil recovery rate. Extend the life of our baseload coal-fired power plants and deliver more affordable, reliable energy to American consumers. Enhanced oil recovery is a proven technology that injects CO2 to produce oil that would otherwise remain trapped underground. For the past 25 years, Dakota Gasification Company has captured and transported CO2 for enhanced oil recovery in the Canadian Weyburn fields. As a matter of fact, I turned the crank on that pipeline back when we first started the project. Now we're working to advance EOR in unconventional shale formations, like in the Bakken. And the Working Families Tax Cut Act provides the policy foundation to expand EOR opportunities in shale plays like the Bakken. We work with Senator Brown